This video is going to be a response to a series of videos by TheoreticalBS on the Kalam Cosmological argument and on William Lane Craig and his defense of the argument in particular. To clarify, before launching into my own personal objections to what TheoreticalBS argues, I want to clarify a couple things. One, this video is in no way meant to prove that the Kalam argument works, merely to show that TheoreticalBS's objections do not work to undermine it. Two, even though I give on some objections a series of arguments against what TheoreticalBS argues, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think these objections are stronger than when I only give one objection. Sometimes certain objections TheoreticalBS makes are more conducive to giving a variety of objections, while others are more conducive to giving a single response. There are probably a number of other misunderstandings that will arise, but those are two that I wanted to get out of the way immediately. So here then are my actual objections to what he argues. One argument he makes is that in causation you have three things. You have an efficient cause, an affect, and an effect. That is, you have to have something creating the change, the efficient cause. You have something being affected, that is something being changed, and something effected, meaning something brought about. Now, TheoreticalBS claims that to say that God affected the universe to cause the universe is an absurd or self-contradictory notion. To this, I would say that this isn't absurd or self-contradictory if causation need not be a temporal process which works in the way that TheoreticalBS describes. The most plausible model of the Kalam argument, and of creatio ex nihilo in general, has God creating the universe at the beginning of time. That is, God causes the universe simultaneously with its coming into existence. Craig, on reasonablefaith.org, in his Q&A number 148, writes, quote, God's creating the universe is simultaneous with the universe's coming into being. What could be more obvious? Close quote. Now, causing time before the beginning of time, would require time to exist before time comes into existence, which is slightly problematic. Causing it afterwards would likewise be problematic, especially if you're an atheist, since on the A theory backwards causation is impossible. So the causal situation at creation, given a plausible Kalam model, would be that God, that is the efficient cause, affects the universe in the same state of affairs in which the effect, the Big Bang, occurs. All three elements of causation, which TheoreticalBS considers essential to causation, that is the efficient cause, the affected party, and the effect, would then still all be involved. Another objection to this argument of TheoreticalBS's is that, well, in personal communication, TheoreticalBS has replied that my model requires time to causally precede time. The idea, I suppose, is something like this. Christians say that although God didn't exist temporally before the universe, he did exist logically, ontologically, or causally prior to the universe. TheoreticalBS replies to that, and his reply would mean something along the lines of this, I suppose. Saying that God simultaneously causes the universe to come into existence would require time to exist causally prior to time itself, and this is impossible. Now, it's true that if this were the case, it would represent an impossible state of affairs, and this hardly be a good counter-argument to TheoreticalBS. But it need not be the case. A Christian should not claim that the cause of the universe was either an event cause or a state cause. It couldn't be a state cause, that is, the cause couldn't properly speaking be a state of affairs, since it would be primarily a change which triggers the beginning of time, and thus some sort of static state couldn't have been the cause of the beginning of time. Likewise, it couldn't have been an event cause either, since given the causal premise, that is, that everything which comes into existence requires a cause, this too would require a cause. Positing an event cause to explain the first event would backfire, though, as that event cause would in turn require a cause. Christians should, then, claim that the cause of the universe was an agent cause, that is, God. If God, qua agent cause, caused the universe, then in no real sense would time have to causally precede time, and thus this objection of TheoreticalBS also falls flat. Now, TheoreticalBS has also personally responded to this argument elsewhere. He didn't go into great detail, but he said that using agent causation to explain the universe in this way is both ad hoc and speculative. I don't know how exactly he would fill out these two objections, but I'm going to make a few suggestions about why such an explanation, an agent causal one, is at least likely not ad hoc. First, a belief in agent causation seems to me very natural. When we ask who or what caused something, the answer is naturally an object of some sort. A person, a basketball, whatever. This, strictly speaking, would be an agent cause if taken literally. We don't say something like, Jim's pouring the coffee burned Marge's hand. We could say this, and if we did, it would properly speaking be referencing event causation, but we don't in fact say this unless we have trained ourselves to speak this way. Since doing what comes naturally normally has some prima facie warrant, it would require some sort of argument for us to reject this very natural belief in agent causation. Another objection of mine would be that it is questionable whether there is or even could be such a thing as event causation as anything other than merely a façon de parler, or a manner of speaking. On this, see Plantinga's advice to Christian philosophers. In a note, he suggests that there might not actually be any such thing as event causation. Now, after all, what is an event? Any plausible definition of event, in my opinion, would entail that event causation is only informative at all if it is ultimately reducible to agent causation. One can say that the basketball's bouncing caused the broken window, but unless this is ultimately reducible to the basketball caused the broken window, agent causation, it's entirely unclear what it could mean. I agree with something that Richard Swinburne has argued on this topic. Although speaking in terms of event causation is sometimes more useful and feasible than speech in terms of agent causation, ultimately all causation is agent causation. As an aside, you should note that all causation is agent causation. This does not mean that all causation is the result of free will. A belief that all causation is ultimately agent causation does not entail animism or occasionalism or anything like that. E.J. Lowe, another proponent of the stance that all causation is agent causation, describes rocks, for example, as agent causes, but he doesn't suggest that rocks have minds or free will. Free will requires more than just agent causation. So to sum up, it does no good to object that this view would require animism or occasionalism or anything like that, because it just doesn't. Now, my final response to theoretical BS on this point is that if the rest of the Kalam argument, that is, the causal premise and the second premise that there was a beginning of time, is supported, then so is agent causation, as it's entailed by these two premises. If there was a first event, and all events require causes, the cause of the first event would have to be an agent cause for reasons already described. So to say agent causation is ad hoc is only true if the Kalam already fails for other reasons. Thus, this objection by theoretical BS cannot stand on its own. In order to argue that this argument is ad hoc, one needs independent grounds for thinking that the Kalam argument fails. Another objection of theoretical BS is that nobody has ever witnessed creatio ex nihilo, and rejecting it is more parsimonious. In response, say that, in order for one to witness or observe something, it is sufficient to indirectly observe something. So, say there's a complex phenomenon, A plus B, only part of which, A, one directly observes. Say that it's also known that A entails B, so that even though one only directly observes A, one can know that B is involved as well. If it's fair to say that, in such a situation, one observes or can observe B, then it seems to me that this objection begs the question against dualism. If dualism is true, and souls, as is usually believed, are created ex nihilo, then rather obviously there are billions of things, that is, persons, which exist which have no material cause. It is also rather obvious that people have observed parts of the relevant activities involved in bringing no persons into existence, that is, doing it, which entail that non-physical entities, souls, come into existence even though they don't directly observe the souls coming into existence. The same with the view that abstracta can come into existence. Some philosophers believe abstract objects come into existence, and if they do, then they can have no material cause since they aren't material entities to begin with. Elsewhere, theoretical BS cites Craig as giving examples of the equator in Beethoven's music as abstracta which come into existence according to certain metaphysical systems. It is highly unlikely that people directly observe abstracta or their coming into existence. If they know about them at all, they know about them via some cognitive faculty quite different from anything realistically labeled observation. Yet nevertheless, they can know that these abstracta exist through the sort of inference earlier described. It should be mentioned, however, that both Theoretical BS and I are nominalists, and thus the latter observation I made here will not personally give him much grief. He was also not a dualist. Nevertheless, this argument of his needs to at least be able to show why these other beliefs, that is, dualism and a sort of contingent Platonism or a contingent realm of abstracta, why these views are false. Now, another objection to what Theoretical BS argues here is that given a narrower and I think better definition of observation, basically equivalent to a common sense notion of such a thing, that is, roughly some sort of sense perception, it is at least questionable whether people could properly speaking directly observe creatio ex nihilo even if it did occur. One cannot observe a soul coming into existence, nor can one observe an abstractum doing the same, for the very simple reason that these things do not lend themselves to sense perception. If we know about these things, we must know about them through something other than sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. As far as matter in particular coming into existence, one could certainly observe some batch of matter appearing, perhaps Craig's horse which pops into existence, but would one actually observe the ex nihilo facet of this? It's true that one wouldn't positively observe an ex materia cause, but it isn't entirely clear that this is the same thing as positively observing an ex nihilo cause. It seems more plausible, again, that the ex nihilo portion would have to be known through some other means than sense perception or observation. One last objection to this objection of Theoretical BS is that it succumbs to the sort of objection that one of Hume's point about miracles succumbs to. His point was that nobody at any time anywhere has observed such a thing. But if something like Christ's miracle of multiplying the fish and loaves or any other potential ex nihilo miracle actually occurred, then it rather obviously is the case that such things have been observed, even if extremely rarely. Another point that Theoretical BS raises is that to say that God exists without the universe and then God exists with the universe is not the same thing as to say that God has to be the cause of the universe. Now, in reply to that, I would say that given the causal premise and the extremely plausible assumption that nothing can cause itself to come into existence, this conclusion actually does follow. If in one state of affairs only God exists, and then in a subsequent state of affairs it's just God in the universe, the only thing that exists other than the universe would be God, and thus if the universe has a cause at all, it would have to be God. Unless, of course, one wants to fill out the first state of affairs as including things other than God, maybe angels, demons, maybe Abe Vigoda, but that is not how it was presented by Theoretical BS. Theoretical BS also claims that Craig's only reason for rejecting ex materia causation across the board are abstracta. That is to say, that the only example Craig gives of things popping into existence without material causes are abstracta, and this is the aforementioned thing about the equator and Beethoven's music. Now, Theoretical BS's response here is simply, or his Theoretical BS's point here is simply false, as Craig is a dualist. On reasonablefaith.org, in his Q&A number 314, Craig writes, quote, it struck me forcefully that this is exactly what the dualist interactionist would expect. That is, the results of Benjamin Libet or Libet's experiments. Not sure how to pronounce that name. The soul, or mind, does not act independently of the brain. Rather, as the Nobel Prize-winning neurologist Sir John Eccles put it, the mind uses the brain as an instrument to think. So, of course, the soul's decisions are not simultaneous with the conscious awareness of them. How could they be? Given the soul's reliance upon the brain as an instrument of thought and the finite velocity of the transmission of neural signals, of course there is a time lag between the mind's decisions and the awareness of them. In Libet or Libet's experiment, since neural processes travel at finite velocities, of course it takes time for the mind's decision to come to consciousness. This is exactly what we should expect on a dualist interactionist view, end quote. But of course Craig is saying all this presupposing that interactionist dualism is in fact correct. Now, souls are non-material entities, which, except for God anyway, come into existence. Not even being made of matter, they can't possibly be created ex materia. Thus, their creation, if they're created at all, would be ex nihilo, What's important here is not whether or not dualism is true. It could be false, and this objection by theoretical BS would still not work, since the objection he raises is merely about Craig's reasons for rejecting ex materia causation across the board, and Craig is certainly and absolutely a dualist. Theoretical BS also claims that when Craig says that these different paradoxes of the infinite, which he adduces to support the idea that the universe began to exist, when Craig says that these are absurd, theoretical BS then turns it around and says, well, that may be true, but merely absurd is not as bad as something like contradictory or impossible, and therefore we should prefer absurdities to things which are contradictory or impossible. In response to this, I would say that these things aren't really thought of by Kalam proponents to be merely absurd. They are thought to be both absurd and impossible, which is stronger than merely impossible or contradictory. Something might be contradictory, but be so complicated that nobody notices the contradiction. Take contradictions found in any number of fictional stories, such as the Iliad. It features two different stories of how the god Hephaestus became lame, one in Book 1, the other in Book 18. Reading straight through the Iliad, I imagine many readers, by the time they get to Book 18, don't even notice that the story in Book 1 contradicts that in Book 18, but it's undeniably there. Many such contradictions are passed over without even being noticed. Other impossibilities are not absurd either. So take Goldbach's conjecture, the notion that every even integer greater than 2 can be expressed as the sum of two primes. Mathematicians do not know whether or not Goldbach's conjecture is true, but Goldbach's conjecture is either true or false, and necessarily so, since numbers wouldn't have such properties merely contingently. Thus, it's either impossible that it be true, or impossible that it be false, but it's definitely too strong to say that either is absurd. So when Craig or another Kalam proponent speaks of any of the paradoxes of the infinite as absurd, the person probably means more than merely preposterous. Impossible or contradictory is probably implied as well. For more proof of this, simply note all the many, very, very many times that Craig refers to such things as impossible, even though he doesn't necessarily explicitly spell it out that impossibility is included in his notion of absurdity, or at least his notion of absurdity as applied to these paradoxes. Another point raised by theoretical BS is that arguing about the causal premise, the game, so to speak, has changed vis-à-vis causation from the beginning of time versus now. That is, it may be the case that things don't just pop into existence now without a cause, even though they could have at the beginning of time, because the sort of game has changed. The causal game has changed from the beginning of time. That is, different rules apply. The laws of nature are in effect. The different laws which perhaps require efficient causation were not there at the beginning of time. Something along those lines. Another issue that theoretical BS raises is Craig's question of why, absent a causal principle, do things like horses not just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing all the time? And theoretical BS, I imagine, would accept that this doesn't in fact happen, but he has an answer for why this doesn't happen, and his answer, roughly, is that the game has changed vis-a-vis causation. That is, that at the beginning of time, perhaps the causal principle wasn't in effect yet, and so the universe could have popped into existence uncaused out of nothing, even if nowadays things can't. So things have changed now. That's the main idea here with his objection to what Craig says. Now, there seem to me a few problems with this. The first is that if at the beginning of time the causal principle was not in effect, it becomes entirely unclear why any number of other things didn't pop into existence in addition to or instead of what did in fact come into existence. Since things wouldn't require causes, why wouldn't they then pop into existence? Why didn't Craig's horse pop into existence at the beginning of time, immediately to melt away into a sweet Indiana Jones-style skeleton? Why didn't the leprechaun from the hit Leprechaun horror series pop into existence? The examples could be multiplied ad infinitum, but the point should be clear. Without the causal principle in place, there's no reason these things shouldn't have popped into existence. But it doesn't seem they did. Or did they? Now, in personal communication, theoretical BS has explained that, in his opinion, the universe which did in fact pop into existence came about as a matter of simplicity. There was something simple about this universe, which meant that this batch of stuff, as opposed to some other batch, popped into existence. Now, I have two main objections to this. One, why would simplicity in any way outweigh the lack of a causal principle? Even if it might be simpler for one horse to pop into existence than 100, since there'd be nothing stopping any of these things from popping into existence, it would be, as Craig says, inexplicable that only one, rather than 100 or 1,000,000 or whatever, popped into existence instead. Two, simplicity doesn't seem even in principle capable of favoring this universe over possible alternatives. There are a number of different senses in which something can be simple, and I refer the viewer to Richard Swinburne's excellent and short book Simplicity as Evidence of Truth for more on this. But a couple of obvious sorts of simplicity would be that something is simpler if it features fewer entities or fewer types of entity. Okay, but if that's so, wouldn't simplicity have favored a universe popping into existence with a lower amount of matter and energy, or even no kind of matter and energy at all? Even if the beginning of the universe was simple in some sense, it's hard to buy that it would have been selected for its simplicity over other possible and obviously simpler alternatives. Another issue which theoretical BS raises is something that Quentin Smith has talked about a little bit, and Smith's objection here is basically that there's no account of causation currently on offer in the philosophical literature which would be workable to explain creatio ex nihilo. Theoretical BS really doesn't go into much detail on this, but you can read Smith's work on this. I think Theoretical BS links to it if you want more on it. But the idea, again, is just that philosophers have come up with no account of causation which would allow for creatio ex nihilo. In objection, I note that this just does not seem to me to be true. An agent causal model of causation could rather easily work for creatio ex nihilo. To sort of paraphrase Chisholm's famous formulation, all this would require is that God be eternal, that the universe come into existence, and that it be the case that, if it weren't for God, the universe wouldn't have come into existence. Now, these are rather minimal requirements, quite easily met. Agent causation could happen simultaneously with creation, thus allowing a caused beginning of time without need of a further cause, since the agent in question would be eternal. It also would eliminate one direction of causation, that is, that the universe could possibly have caused God instead of the other way around, which is similar to Smith's objection to a counterfactual analysis of causation. Now, God, being eternal, could have no cause, at least certainly no temporal cause, and since there could only be one cause involved, there could be no sort of circular causation, where God causes the universe, which causes God, which causes the universe, and so on. The earliest there could have been a cause of God would have been at the first moment of time, since that is the first state of affairs that includes the universe. But since God exists timelessly without the universe, that means there was a state of affairs where God existed ontologically prior to any possible cause of God, that is, such as the universe, and that means that it's impossible that the universe caused God. The direction of causation from God to universe is therefore required. Now, even if Smith's claim that no current philosophical models of causation explain creatio ex nihilo were true, it would be easily explicable and not really detrimental to the Kalam argument. Most philosophical work on causation is done assuming causation is essentially event causation. But since, as already explained, event causation cannot even theoretically support creatio ex nihilo as featured in the Kalam argument, the fact that philosophical analyses of causation can't explain creatio ex nihilo doesn't really undercut the Kalam. Now, this next point I want to raise is a biggie. This is theoretical BS's kind of widespread attack on Craig's misinterpretation of his argument. Theoretical BS is a number of things that are really disparaging of Craig, basically because he seems upset, frustrated, something like that Craig didn't understand his argument. Now, I actually agree that Craig misunderstood the argument, so there's nothing to be debated there. What I want to talk about, though, is whether or not Craig is deserving of such abuse. So, there are two possibilities here, which is that Craig replied basically knowing nothing else about theoretical BS. The other is that he replied knowing other stuff about theoretical BS. That is, either Craig had done some research or he hadn't. I'm going to look at whether or not his response, his interpretation of theoretical BS's argument is justified given either of those assumptions. Now, assuming Craig didn't research further, is his answer justified? Yes. The natural, plain-text reading of the argument's premises leads to one of two possibilities. Either 1, all sorts of things come into existence without an efficient cause, or nothing comes into existence. Those are the two natural plain-text readings. Now, the fact that these are the normal interpretations is actually borne out by theoretical BS himself when he imagines a potential respondent saying that, well, carpenters cause tables, and so on, things of that nature. Well, theoretical BS replies that this is not exactly true because carpenters, strictly speaking, do not cause the table or anything like that. They merely cause the table's elements to be rearranged to form a table. But this comment by theoretical BS presupposes that the normal way to think and speak of causation would allow that carpenters do cause tables. Even philosophers speak this way, so Craig, given merely the premises as stated in theoretical BS's videos, would be justified in interpreting it the way that he does. There are also a number of web atheists who argue that nothing comes into existence at all. Now, I don't know exactly when this wave of argument came about. Maybe it was after Craig's response to theoretical BS's argument, or after theoretical BS's video, I Kalam like I see him, I don't know. But if there were a fair number of such people arguing this way before Craig made his response, and Craig was aware of this, Craig would have at least been reasonable to assume that theoretical BS's argument was another version of this oft-repeated argument. Now, the other possibility is that Craig did research further, and if he did, would his answer have been justified then? It seems to me that arguably, anyway, the answer is yes. Theoretical BS has a number of other earlier videos in which he argues that, strictly speaking, nothing comes into existence, namely, I Kalam like I see him. Now, according to this video, the things we see come into existence are nothing more than mere rearrangements of pre-existing matter, and not really things coming into existence in their own right. Given that such a video is out there, and certainly a prominent production in theoretical BS's body of work, at the time of Craig's response it would have been as relevant as any, if Craig had delved deeper into the theoretical BS corpus, he would have had plenty of justification for his interpretation of the argument. Also, from personal experience debating people online about this argument, I initially thought that theoretical BS was arguing either of the two natural interpretations I gave earlier. I've read all of Craig's central scholarly works on the Kalam argument, on the philosophy of time, and on God's relation to time, and I agree with most of it, so I assume that my response, my understanding of theoretical BS's argument, at least approximates what Craig would think. It's realistic to think that this sort of thing would happen, in fact, to anyone reasonably familiar with the Kalam and not familiar with, or even in fact familiar with, theoretical BS's other work. The next point I'm simply going to sort of offer a promissory note towards. It's that theoretical BS talks about how the second premise of the Kalam argument is a scientific question. That is, science should answer that question, and philosophy perhaps has not too much to say on it. Now, all I want to say here is that this is way too complicated an issue to discuss right now. I plan on making some videos related to the Kalam argument that will better express my views on this topic. So for right now, I'll just say that I strongly disagree with this as well, but it'll have to wait for another occasion. Another point that theoretical BS makes is that he feels that Craig cherry-picks because of a presupposed theology. Now, in response to this, I say that this is highly doubtful. At the least, it's very uncharitable. That it's uncharitable I take as obvious. All one needs to do is merely soak in theoretical BS's many disparaging comments on the matter. Now, why is it doubtful? Well, for at least two reasons. First, Craig thinks there are several good arguments for God's existence, and although he has said that Kalam is the most powerful in his opinion, he thinks others, like the fine-tuning argument, the moral argument, the modal ontological argument, etc., also all provide a lot of support for theism, and he thinks the argument for the resurrection strongly supports Christianity in particular. He has no need to prop up any specific argument, since there are, in Craig's opinion, so many good ones. A theist in Craig's shoes can happily accept that some theistic arguments are bad, even major ones, while still holding the view that natural theology nowadays is quite strong. Craig also has no need to keep this argument alive for personal career-based reasons, since he has published on a number of topics quite apart from the Kalam. There's also the whole job security for professors bit. The second reason to think this interpretation by theoretical BS is doubtful is because religious believers in general seem perfectly fine with believing in God without much by way of evidence. And since Craig himself has published several things saying that even given lack of arguments for God's existence, he'd still believe, based on the internal testimony of the Holy Spirit, there seems little need for Craig to cherry-pick his evidence here. You'd have to assume Craig is delusional or lying, and since his stance here would be pretty standard for a theist, it's more plausible and charitable to assume that even if Craig is wrong in his reasoning, it isn't here due to any sort of presupposed theology. My next point is going to seem kind of weird because it seems that theoretical BS in principle or in theory grants that God could have more power than I would. So because theoretical BS says that nothing is incoherent about the idea that God created the universe from something non-physical. So he's talking about options other than creatio ex nihilo here. Perhaps God took something non-physical and made it into the universe. Now, on the contrary, it does in fact seem incoherent. Given the metaphysical view known as mereological essentialism, on which see Chisholm's great book Person and Object, according to which, that is according to mereological essentialism, things essentially have their parts. Now, according to that theory, this is impossible. And since mereological essentialism is true, this situation proposed by theoretical BS is in fact incoherent. Now, why think that mereological essentialism is true at all? Well, this is also a complicated matter, but to keep things short, imagine a situation where you have some entity with 5 parts, A, B, C, D, and E. Then imagine you take away E. How is it sensible to say that A through E is identical to A through D? If A through D is the same as A through E, then why not A through C, or A through B, or even just A? Why not add any number of things to A through E and claim it's equivalent to A through E? Few philosophers that I'm aware of accept mereological essentialism, but their reasons for doing so strike me as very weak. One common objection is that it just goes against normal thought. We don't think that if somebody scratches our TV, scraping off a few random atoms, that it's not the same TV as it was before. Now, that's true, but as Chisholm would point out, this is merely the loose and popular way of speaking, and of thinking, I might add. And since it's still more or less the same TV, it's still the same TV functionally speaking, it's still 50 inches, it's still high definition, whatever, there's no reason to make a point of noting that it is not, strictly speaking, identical with the earlier TV. Another objection to mereological essentialism often given is that it leads to absurdities. Since we people change atoms all the time, and we're nothing more than our atoms, yet we stay the same person over time, then mereological essentialism must be false. The first part of this is true. We do trade out our supply of atoms all the time. The next part is dubious, however. There are major problems with theories of personal identity that assume we are just our bodies, and this point is one of the major ones. And what's more, the fact that we stay the same person over time can't carry any weight with theoretical BS since he doesn't even believe this. He believes the self is an illusion. To sum up then, there are serious doubts about whether God could make one set of parts out of an entirely different set of parts as described before. I refer people interested to a further argument that a non-physical thing could not become a physical thing, applied in particular to the incarnation. I refer such people to Planning's chapter entitled Materialism and Christian Belief in the book Persons, Human and Divine, edited by Peter Van Inwagen and Dean Zimmerman. The next point I'd like to raise is to a comment that Theoretical BS makes. He talks about things nowadays. He says these things don't come into being out of nothing. How could they, since the universe already exists? Now, I'm not entirely sure what the logic behind this objection is supposed to be. It doesn't seem to be true that, for example, anything which already exists has to serve as causal basis for anything else which is caused to exist at a later time. Montana exists, and it existed before I was born, but I doubt anybody would want to seriously claim that I was created ex Montana. Even Tony Montana, unfortunately. I've never been to Montana, and as far as I know, my parents were never there either. Frogs exist likewise, but to say I was created ex Urana, Latin for frog, is probably a stretch. Examples could be multiplied, but the basic point should be clear. Another interpretation of this argument would be that since the universe exists as it does now, certain causal rules are in place now, though they might not have been earlier, and as such, anything which is created now must be created ex materia. There are a number of things that could be said to this, but I'll just note this one thing. I've never seen anybody seriously propose this as an objection to ex nihilo creation of souls, that is, dualism. And I've read quite a lot of philosophy of mind, including works focusing on dualism. I'm sure somebody out there has pressed such an objection, but I personally, anyway, am unaware of anybody doing this. Maybe George Smith did it, I don't know. My point here is just that seemingly nobody among the major opponents of dualism has thought of using this argument to argue against dualism. And that's rather hard to explain, given the fact that if this were a good objection, it would be such an obvious one. I would welcome clarification on this point by TheoreticalBS, as I cannot think of a reading of his comment which results in a plausible argument, but that might just be my lack of imagination. TheoreticalBS also notes that there's another double standard at play here for Craig. He notes that minds, for example, are never quiescent either. Craig noted that matter is never quiescent, so there couldn't have been eternal matter. TheoreticalBS is turning it around and saying, well, minds aren't quiescent either, and therefore God couldn't have been eternal because his mind would have had to have been active and thus have set up some sort of infinite temporal series, something along those lines. Now, I have a few objections to this. First, a mind for TheoreticalBS is undoubtedly just a glob of matter behaving in certain ways. To say that such a thing is never quiescent is, of course, totally consonant with the point a Kalam proponent would want to make, that is, that matter is never quiescent. If the mind is matter and matter is never quiescent, then the mind is never quiescent. But most Kalam proponents, if not all of them, would say that the mind simply is not a material being. Kalam proponents would, however, mostly object to the idea that the mind is a physical entity, and if minds are taken instead in a dualistic way, it is far from obvious that such a mind would have to be active, since a mind would then have no atoms tirelessly flitting and floating about. Another objection to this is that minds in our experience are essentially always connected to bodies, so they take the form of, again, some kind of composite like A plus B, that is, mind plus brain. Since the B element here, the brain, is matter, and matter is taken by sophisticated Kalam proponents to never be quiescent, this again is wholly consonant with what a Kalam proponent would say, that matter itself is never quiescent. That matter plus something else is never quiescent should come as no surprise to a Kalam proponent. Matter plus anything, except a relevant miracle, is never quiescent, so matter plus a mind would also never be quiescent. My third objection is that perhaps the main problem with the argument is that it moves from the universal presence of a trait to the essentiality of a trait. Anybody familiar with Thomas Morris's book, The Logic of God Incarnate, should know what I'm about to say here. Just because something is, in our experience, always the case hardly means that it must essentially be that way. The mere fact that minds are never quiescent hardly means that they must be active. A Kalam proponent could easily point to the fact that we know, not merely from experience or induction per se, but from the very laws of nature, that matter cannot, without a miracle, be quiescent, while we know no such thing about minds. It certainly is not a law of nature that minds can never be quiescent, unless you want to claim that it's a law of nature that dualism is false, and for what it's worth, it isn't. One more sort of minor point that TheoreticalBS brings up that I take issue with. He says that you can argue that matter could be quiescent outside of time, even if never so inside of time. My objection to this has to be, again, somewhat promissory, but here it's only because I'm not exactly sure what TheoreticalBS thinks time is. On the relational view of time, time is nothing more than a relation between events, and as such, it's rather unexciting metaphysically. To say that something exists outside of time would merely then be to say that it exists in a state of affairs without events. But there's nothing about events or their absence per se, which would confer any such causal powers upon matter. As such, being outside of time, if time is just a relation, would be irrelevant to whether or not matter can be quiescent. Time might be a substance, however. That would be the substantival view of time. Now, not knowing TheoreticalBS's view on the matter, I refrain from saying anything more than that for a person who stresses parsimony so much, the relational view of time should be highly attractive, since it, unlike the substantival view, does not require positing time as a substance in its own right. I come to my final major point, and it is rather a major one, as it's the main point of TheoreticalBS's most recent video, which essentially is that Craig has to cherry pick different things in order to come to his conclusion. Or in other words, all the apologetic gymnastics that Craig uses to get to an efficient without a material cause can also lead to efficient and material cause, a material without an efficient cause, and even an eternal universe. So that is that Craig only chooses the one induction, not these other inductions, even though he should, if he were being reasonable and not cherry picking, make all the inductions. The first thing to note is kind of a minor point, but should perhaps be stressed a little bit anyway, which is that it's of course hyperbole to say that all of the quote-unquote apologetic gymnastics that Craig uses can be used to get to these other things as well, since the Kalam has any number of arguments supporting it, different lines of defense, things like that. So of course it's not all of the apologetic gymnastics. At best it's this one line. But that being said, let's look at these different things that TheoreticalBS says should lead to, that Craig's line of reasoning should lead to, but doesn't, simply because Craig cherry picks. The first objection is dealing with the second potential induction. It's rather obviously true that Craig's reasoning cannot lead to the conclusion that there was a material cause of the universe but no efficient cause, as his reasoning requires efficient causation for all events. So if all our experience supports the causal premise, that is basically that all events require efficient causation, you can't say it's also consistent with the denial of such a principle. Worded yet another way, if all our experience is in favor of the causal premise and there's nothing against it, which is what Craig espouses, you obviously cannot use the same line of reasoning to conclude that the universe had a beginning but no efficient cause. That conclusion is wholly inconsistent with Craig's line of reasoning. Now moving on to the second potential induction, Craig doesn't treat induction as an intrinsic defeater, that is, as a belief which automatically defeats any possible counter-evidence. Craig claims that all our experiences support the causal premise and nothing weighs against it, which implies that something could weigh against this induction. But if that's his principle, then he wouldn't at all be cherry-picking to deny that everything that comes into existence must have a material cause, since Craig is a dualist. On his view, we have plenty of experience, if not observation, of things that begin to exist without material causes, namely, souls. So even though the claim that everything that begins to exist has a material cause has some plausibility, as Craig says, there is in fact counter-evidence, at least in Craig's mind. He thinks there are good arguments against the notion that all things which come into existence require a material cause, since he thinks souls begin to exist. So consistent application of Craig's principle does not lead to what TheoreticalBS says it does. Craig, again, does not have to cherry pick to avoid this nasty conclusion that TheoreticalBS alludes to. As for the third potential induction, I'm not entirely sure what the induction here is even supposed to be. Perhaps this? Premise 1, everything we've seen is not a beginning of the universe. Therefore, probably everything is not a beginning of the universe. The premise is true, though how exactly could we have viewed such a thing anyway? The conclusion is dubious, however. Not all inductions are created epistemically equal, and I doubt that any induction in this area would be on a par with the induction to the causal premise. I again welcome a clarification from TheoreticalBS. Perhaps this is not the induction he was intending, but I don't see any plausible induction anywhere else in this neighborhood, and thus it's unlikely that Craig has to cherry pick to avoid an eternal universe. Moreover, to say that such a conclusion, an eternal universe, is more parsimonious than its denial, even if this is true, is completely irrelevant to the line of argument being presented by TheoreticalBS. Parsimony has nothing to do with induction, which is what Craig's line of reasoning involves, but rather what's known as abduction, that is, inference to the best explanation. Thus, whether or not such a conclusion is more parsimonious is a red herring. It might be a good point, but it is a separate point. So those are all my major objections to what TheoreticalBS argues in his series of videos on the Kalam Cosmological argument. Before I end, though, I'd like to briefly recap my objections, not to make this too much horribly longer, but because the video is so long, perhaps it's best to summarize the conclusions I've come to at the end. His first objection was that creatio ex nihilo violates the three things that you need in any causal relation. You need an efficient cause, an affect, and an effect. I tried to show that that is not the case, that you could have all three if the causation is at the beginning of time. His second objection was that nobody has ever witnessed creatio ex nihilo, and rejecting it is more parsimonious, whereas I argued that this is based on a couple of different possible ideas or concepts of witnessing or observation. On a narrow meaning of observation, it's true that nobody's ever witnessed it, probably, but then again, how could anybody? And therefore, this objection doesn't have any weight if that's the interpretation of witnessing. If by witnessing you allow a broader sense of what would count as witnessing, then arguably people have witness creatio ex nihilo, and thus this would need to be argued against. And finally, a sort of Humean objection that to say that nobody has ever witnessed this is simply to assume that all the claims to having, sort of in a broader sense, witnessed creatio ex nihilo, you simply have to assume that these are all wrong, and you couldn't have independent grounds for each and every single one, or for all the ones that you don't know about. The only reason to think that all these claims to having witnessed it are false would be if you had some kind of larger theory that entailed that they couldn't have done such a thing, and therefore this would be sort of parasitic on a further sort of theoretical reason. You couldn't have individual historical reasons, there'd be far too many. For number 3, he argues that to say that God exists without the universe and then God exists with the universe does not mean that God is the cause, but that doesn't actually follow based on pretty sensible assumptions about causation. For 4, he argues that Craig's only reason for rejecting ex materia causation as a sort of broad universal principle would be abstracta, that abstracta come into existence without a cause, even though Craig himself rejects this notion. Now that isn't correct, because Craig rather clearly has other reasons for rejecting ex materia causation across the board, namely dualism. For 5, the sort of merely absurd versus contradictory split, I tried to argue that when someone like TheoreticalBS says that merely absurd is not as bad as contradictory, that's actually true, but none of the Kalam proponents think that these paradoxes and these bizarre consequences are merely absurd. They think they're absurd and contradictory or impossible, and thus any opponent of the Kalam has to show that they are in fact merely absurd and not impossible. For 6, to say that the game has changed vis-à-vis causation such that even now you can't have horses, for example, popping into existence uncaused, even if you could have at the beginning of time. That might answer why horses don't pop into existence now uncaused out of nothing, but it doesn't explain why all these things didn't pop into existence uncaused out of nothing at the beginning of time if there were no causal principle present. Given that there's no causal principle at that point in time in that state of affairs, then theoretically any of these things should have, or at least could have, and therefore would have, since they wouldn't have needed a cause, popped into existence. And so this claim simply isn't strong enough on TheoreticalBS's part. It saves the fact that we don't observe these things popping into existence uncaused out of nothing now, but it can't at all explain why these things didn't happen at the beginning of time. His 7th objection was that Smith shows that there are no workable accounts of causation to explain creatio ex nihilo. Argue that that's false. Agent causation can, and that's the preferred account anyway, for reasons I explain. But I also argued that even if this were true and there were no workable accounts of causation in philosophy, that wouldn't really damage the Kalam all that much, for the simple reason that almost no work in modern philosophy really is done in the realm of agent causation. Most philosophers believe in pretty much event causation across the board, and thus the fact that their event causal models can't explain the beginning of time is not exactly all that impressive, because it couldn't even theoretically explain the beginning of time. As for Craig's misinterpretation, sort of point 8, I tried to show that Craig's misinterpretation, although it is in fact a misinterpretation, is warranted whether or not Craig did further research, since TheoreticalBS has other videos out there, namely I Kalam Like I See Him, where he argues basically what Craig interprets him as arguing in his main argument, and thus you couldn't really fault Craig for coming to that conclusion if he did do further research. If he hadn't done further research, it's still an explicable interpretation, because TheoreticalBS uses words in a sort of non-standard way in his argument, namely the ideas of causation. Remember, see Theoretical BS on the idea of carpenters causing tables. For number 9, his objection was that the second premise is a scientific question. Now, I disagree with that, but that would make this video even longer than it is, so I'm not going to go into any greater detail now. His 10th objection was that Craig cherry-picks because of a presupposed theology. I tried to argue that that is unlikely and uncharitable because, for a number of reasons, because Craig, for example, thinks that there are any number of good arguments for God's existence, and thus he wouldn't need to necessarily prop up anyone in particular. Having job security, he wouldn't need to keep propping up anything for the sake of publishing articles on it, and besides, he publishes on any number of things, so even if he did want to prop up his career, he'd have any number of venues there. Also, see the different types of abuse leveled at Craig by Theoretical BS in a few of his videos to show why it's, or to see rather, why it's rather uncharitable. Number 11, his objection was that there's nothing incoherent about God creating the universe from something non-physical. I argued that it is in fact incoherent because the non-physical and the physical would share certain, would rather have certain essential traits which do not overlap, which are contradictory, and that something which is non-physical cannot, strictly speaking, become physical, or the other way around. So even though we have stories where God, for example, maybe appears as a burning bush, that doesn't mean that the burning bush literally is God or anything like that. It means that he sort of manifests his power in that form. It's incoherent to think that one sort of thing with one set of essential properties could become another sort of thing with a totally different set of essential properties. His 12th objection was that certain things, they don't come into being out of nothing, but since, well, how could they? The universe already exists. I tried to argue that I'm not exactly sure what this means, but if it means what I interpret it as meaning, then it clearly is false, because there are all kinds of things that exist that I wasn't created out of, for example, such as the state of Montana, the great state of Montana, or frogs. For number 13, Theoretical BS argues that there's another double standard employed by Craig because Craig ignores the fact that minds, much like matter, are never quiescent either. And I tried to argue that, well, that doesn't exactly follow. Theoretical BS is probably assuming the mind is matter, and therefore this would fall under Craig's sort of purview, his own view that matter is never quiescent. But since minds aren't matter, there's no reason to think that minds have to be never quiescent either, for the simple reason that you can't really make that induction even from universally shared trait. There's nothing sort of essential about a mind that means it has to be active, whereas there does seem to be stuff about matter that makes it have to be active. For his 14th objection, he says that you could argue that matter could be quiescent outside of time, even if never quiescent in time. To that, I simply say that it kind of raises the question of what exactly is time. If it's just a relation between events, there's no reason to think that merely being outside of time would sort of confer these bizarre static powers upon matter. Even if no matter what you think of time, really, it might be true that matter would have to be quiescent outside of time for the simple reason that if it weren't quiescent outside of time, it wouldn't be outside of time in the first place. It would be setting up a temporal series. But rather, what this shows isn't what Theoretical BS wants it to show, but rather that if matter could exist outside of time, it would be through a miracle, because matter of its own power has to be active. And number 15, the final objection, basically in Theoretical BS's most recent video, is that all of Craig's apologetic gymnastics should lead to the conclusion of an efficient without a material cause. The reasoning that leads to an efficient without a material cause of the beginning of the universe could also lead to an efficient with a material cause, a material without an efficient cause, and even an eternal universe. I argue that that's not true at all. Obviously, the same reasoning cannot lead it to a material without efficient cause, since his reasoning already leads to the fact that there has to be an efficient cause. As far as there being both an efficient and material cause, that also is not true in Craig's case, because Craig thinks there are reasons to believe that ex materia causation is not essential to causation, namely dualism. And finally, that the induction should, if consistent, lead also to an eternal universe. On that point, I'm simply unsure what the induction is even supposed to be. But whatever it is, parsimony doesn't help here vis-a-vis induction, because parsimony is simply a different sort of reasoning.